The envelope was empty. Grace Marino knew it was empty because she was the one who had counted the money inside it that morning, folded it back exactly the way she found it, and placed it under the false bottom of the study drawer where Mr. Conti kept it, same as she did every Tuesday when she dusted that room. Now it was Thursday, the envelope was empty, and 4 men in dark suits were standing in the doorway of the staff quarters, watching her fold sweaters into a suitcase like she had done something worth watching. But the man who mattered was not standing in the doorway. He was seated in the leather chair across from her narrow bed, hands folded, waiting. Vincenzo Conti did not raise his voice. He never had to. The room did the work for him, the way it always did. Servants glancing at the floor when he walked past, grown men going quiet mid-sentence. He sat now with the stillness of a man who had already decided the outcome of this conversation before it started, and Grace understood, watching him, that the only thing left to determine was how much dignity she would keep on her way out the door. Grace Marino was 25 years old and had worked at the Conti estate for 14 months. One of 6 staff who lived in the modest wing behind the kitchens, a hallway of small rooms the family called the staff quarters and the staff called home, because it was the only one most of them had. She cleaned. She was good at it, meticulous in a way that had gotten her promoted twice in little over a year, from general housekeeping to the private wing where Mr. Conti kept his study, his bedroom, and the locked room at the end of the hall that nobody cleaned but her, because nobody else was trusted to. She was not a small woman, and she had stopped apologizing for that fact somewhere around her 20th birthday, when she'd finally understood that the apology had never once made a room more comfortable, only made her smaller in it, and she had no interest in being smaller for anyone's comfort but her own. She moved through the Conti mansion with the same competence she moved through everything, unhurried, precise, invisible in the particular way staff learned to be invisible, present enough to do the work and absent enough that powerful men forgot she could hear them. That was until 3 weeks earlier, when Vincenzo Conti had stopped forgetting. It started small, a glance that lasted a half-second longer than it needed to, a question about her day that a man in his position had no obligation to ask a woman who cleaned his floors. Grace had noticed and said nothing, because noticing things about Vincenzo Conti was a habit that could get a person killed in this house, and she intended to keep her habits to herself. Now he sat across from her narrow bed, and the accusation hung in the room like smoke that had not yet cleared. $12,000, Vincenzo said. His voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man reading a verdict he had already written. Taken from that drawer sometime between Tuesday and this morning. You are the only person who cleans that room. I am, Grace said, and I didn't take it. Everyone in this house says the same thing when they're caught. Then ask everyone in this house whether they've ever seen me lie to your face, Mr. Conti, and see how many of them can answer that. Something moved behind his eyes, brief and unreadable, gone before she could name it. He studied her the way he studied ledgers, looking for the number that didn't add up. You have 30 seconds to give me a different answer. Grace set down the sweater she was folding and looked at him directly, which staff in this house were not supposed to do, not to his face, not with that much steadiness in her spine. I don't have a different answer because there isn't one. I didn't touch your money, but I know who was in that study Wednesday night after everyone else was asleep, because I heard him on the stairs when I got up for water, and it was not me. And it was not any of the other staff you've got standing in my doorway right now. The room went very still. One of the men by the door shifted his weight. Say the name, Vincenzo said. Say it in front of the men you brought to watch me pack, and see what that costs you, Grace said. I'm not interested in being the reason somebody in this family disappears over $12,000. I'm interested in you believing me or not believing me. And either way, I'll have my things packed within the hour. Vincenzo Conti had not been told no inside his own house in longer than he could easily remember, and something in his jaw tightened at the sound of it now. Not from the refusal itself, but from the fact that it came from a woman standing in a room the size of a closet with a suitcase half full of her entire life, refusing to bend even a little to save herself. He rose from the chair slowly, the movement unhurried the way everything about him was unhurried, and crossed the small room until he stood close enough that Grace had to tilt her chin up to hold his gaze. "Apologize," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Or leave." Grace held his eyes for 3 full seconds before she answered. "I'll leave," she said. "I won't apologize for something I didn't do. Not to you, not to anyone standing behind you." She turned back to her suitcase and kept folding, and if her hands shook slightly, she made certain the shaking stayed below where anyone could see it. That was the moment everything changed, though neither of them understood it yet. Vincenzo said nothing further. He turned and walked out of the room, his men falling into step behind him, and Grace finished packing in a silence so complete she could hear her own pulse in her ears. She had 6 months of savings in a bank account across town, a cousin in the next county who had offered her a couch more than once, and exactly 1 suitcase's worth of belongings that fit her entire adult life into a space the size of a car trunk. It was not much of a landing, but it was hers, and it did not require lying to a man whose word could end careers and, if the rumors among the staff were true, considerably worse than careers. What Grace did not know, could not have known, standing in that small room, finishing her packing with steady hands and a spine that refused to break, was that Vincenzo Conti had walked straight from her doorway into his study and pulled every household ledger from the last 6 months, laying them across his desk with the particular fury of a man forced to confront the possibility that he had been wrong. He found the discrepancy within the hour. Not in Grace's section of the accounts, which balanced to the dollar the way they always had, but in the entries belonging to his nephew, Matteo, a young man Vincenzo had brought into the family business 2 years prior against the advice of nearly everyone who mattered, vouched for personally, trusted with keys to rooms that mattered. The pattern, once Vincenzo looked for it, was not subtle. Small amounts skimmed from petty cash for months, growing bolder as nobody noticed, culminating in $12,000 lifted from a drawer that Matteo, unlike the rest of the household staff, had the family standing to access without anyone questioning why he was in that wing of the house at midnight. Vincenzo sat with that ledger for a long time before he moved. He found Grace in the mansion's rear courtyard an hour later, her suitcase beside her on the gravel path, waiting for the taxi she had called from the kitchen phone because none of the staff dared offer her a ride anywhere near the front gate while Vincenzo's men were still watching. The evening had gone cold, the kind of late autumn chill that came down fast once the sun dropped behind the tree line, and Grace stood with her arms crossed against it, chin still lifted, refusing to look like a woman who had just lost the only steady thing in her life. "It was Matteo," Vincenzo said. No greeting, no preamble. Grace turned, and something in her expression did not soften. Not yet. "I know. You knew, and you let me stand in that room and accuse you instead of simply proving it? I told you exactly what I heard on the stairs, Mr. Conti. You chose not to listen because it was easier to look at the woman with the mop than the nephew you vouched for personally. That's not a mistake I made. That's one you made." The wind moved through the courtyard, cold and dry, carrying the smell of wood smoke from somewhere on the property. Vincenzo studied her for a long moment, the same careful, calculating look he gave every problem that did not resolve the way his instincts predicted it should. "You're right," he said finally, and the word seemed to cost him something physical, a small crack in the stillness he wore like armor. I was wrong to accuse you. I am not a man who says that easily. I noticed, Grace said. It took you an hour and a full ledger to get there. Something that was almost a smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone before it could become one. Stay. Keep your position. I will make certain everyone in this house understands what happened tonight, and why. Grace looked at him for a long moment, at the suitcase sitting between them on the gravel, at the mansion rising gold and lit behind him, and felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who had just spent an hour deciding she could survive without any of it, only to be handed the choice to stay after all. I'll think about it, she said, which was not the answer he expected, and something flickered across his face that told her he had not expected to be told to wait for anything, not by anyone, least of all by the woman who cleaned his floors. She did not get in the taxi that night. She also did not unpack. The following week passed in the particular strangeness of a house adjusting to a shift nobody wanted to name aloud. Mateo was gone within 2 days, sent to handle family business in another city that everyone in the staff quarters understood, without being told directly, was not the kind of assignment a man returned from quickly, if he returned from it at all. The other staff treated Grace differently after that, not with warmth exactly, but with a wary respect that had not existed before, the respect owed to someone who had stood her ground in front of Vincenzo Conti and made him bend first. Vincenzo himself began finding reasons to be in rooms Grace was cleaning, not often enough to be obvious, but often enough that Grace noticed, the way she noticed everything in that house, filing it away without comment. He asked about her days now, actual questions with actual patience for the answers, a habit that unsettled her more than his silence ever had, because silence she understood. This was new territory, and new territory in a house like this one came with risks she was not naive enough to ignore. You don't have to keep finding me, she told him one afternoon, in the long gallery where she was polishing a row of windows overlooking the back gardens. I already decided to stay. You don't need to keep proving something. Vincenzo stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching the gardens rather than her, which she had come to understand was his way of speaking about things that mattered without the vulnerability of eye contact. I am not proving anything, he said. I am simply here. Men like you are not simply anywhere, Mr. Conti. Everything you do has a reason. He turned then, and there was something almost rueful in his expression, an admission he seemed to make against his own instincts. You are correct. The reason is that I find I would rather be in the room you are cleaning than any other room in this house. I have not yet decided what to do about that fact. Grace kept polishing the window in front of her, though her hands had gone very still and did not turn around. Then decide quickly, because I don't intend to spend my days waiting on a decision that isn't mine to make. That was the first time he said her name the way he never said anyone else's. Low and deliberate, like it was a word he was learning to trust. Grace. She turned then, because a name spoken like that was impossible to ignore, and found him closer than she expected, close enough that she could see the specific gray at his temples, the faint scar along his jaw that nobody in the house would explain to her when she'd asked, months earlier, out of simple curiosity rather than any deeper interest. He smelled of cedar and something darker underneath it, and she found herself cataloging the details the way she cataloged everything, filing them somewhere she was not yet ready to examine. This is not a good idea, she said. No, he agreed. It is not. Neither of them moved away. What broke the moment was the sound of a car in the gravel drive below, arriving too fast, tires cutting hard against the stone, and Vincenzo's entire posture changed in an instant, the softness gone as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by the alert stillness of a man calculating threat before he had even confirmed one existed. "Stay here," he said, and was gone before Grace could argue, moving down the gallery with the kind of speed that made clear exactly what kind of man had been standing beside her a moment before. Gentleness and violence living in the same body, inseparable. Grace did not stay. She followed at a distance, close enough to see, far enough to avoid the center of whatever was about to happen, because staying blind in this house had never once made her safer, only more useless when it mattered. The car belonged to a man named Renzo Falco, a rival captain from a family Vincenzo's household staff spoke of only in careful, lowered voices, and he arrived with 3 men behind him, and no patience for the pleasantries that usually preceded any conversation between families in this world. Grace watched from the shadow of the east hallway as Falco stood in the entrance foyer, voice raised in a way that suggested he had already decided violence was the point of the visit, rather than its last resort. "Your nephew owes a debt he can't pay from wherever you've hidden him," Falco said. "I'm not interested in your family's discipline problems, Vincenzo. I'm interested in the money he took from my people before he ever touched yours." "Then you should have come to me before you came armed onto my property," Vincenzo said, his voice carrying none of the warmth Grace had heard in the gallery minutes earlier, replaced entirely by something colder, harder, a version of him she was seeing clearly for the first time. The confrontation moved fast after that, faster than Grace had time to process fully. Falco's men fanning out through the foyer with a purpose that made clear this had never been a conversation at all, and Vincenzo's own men appearing from the edges of the house with the kind of silent coordination that told Grace this was not the first time this particular choreography had played out under this roof. What happened next, Grace would think about for a long time afterward. Falco's hand moved toward his jacket, and before any of Vincenzo's men could react, before Vincenzo himself had fully turned, Grace stepped out from the hallway shadow into the foyer light, holding the heavy brass fire extinguisher she had grabbed without entirely deciding to grab it, and swung it hard into the back of the nearest of Falco's men, the one closest to the door, dropping him to the marble floor in a single motion that startled everyone in the room, including herself.
"He's got a gun,"
she said, loud and clear, pointing at Falco with a steadiness that surprised her more than anyone. "Under his left arm. He went for it the second Mr. Conti turned around." The room froze for a fraction of a second, every eye moving from Grace to Falco and back, and in that fraction, Vincenzo's men closed the distance and had Falco disarmed and pinned before the man could finish the motion he'd started. Vincenzo himself turned to look at Grace, standing in the middle of his foyer holding a fire extinguisher like a weapon, chest heaving, and something in his expression was unlike anything she had seen from him before. Not gratitude exactly, something closer to recognition. Falco was escorted from the property within the hour, disarmed, humiliated, and considerably more careful in his tone than he had been on arrival, his men following in a silence that suggested this particular visit would be remembered as a mistake for a long time to come. The debt discussion would continue through proper channels, Vincenzo made clear, and not through armed men appearing uninvited in his foyer. When the house finally quieted, Vincenzo found Grace in the kitchen, still holding a cup of tea she had not managed to drink, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the moment had passed and left her with nothing to do but feel the aftermath of it. "You could have stayed where I told you to stay," he said, and there was no real reprimand in it, only something rawer underneath. "You could have turned around faster," Grace said, "but neither of us did the smart thing tonight, so I suppose we're even." He sat across from her at the small kitchen table, a place Grace was fairly certain he had never sat before in his life, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I have made a great many enemies in this life," he said finally. Men who would use anyone close to me to reach me. I told myself I would not let anyone else become that kind of liability. And then you stood in my foyer tonight and made yourself exactly that. I made myself the reason you're still standing here, able to say that sentence, Grace said. That's different from a liability. Something shifted in his face, an admission arriving the way admissions always seemed to arrive with him, slow and reluctant, and then suddenly complete. It is. You're right. The days that followed carried a different quality than any that had come before. The household staff whispering about the fire extinguisher and the woman who cleaned floors and had faced down an armed man without flinching. The story growing with each retelling until Grace barely recognized herself in it. One of the housemaids, a quiet woman named Priscilla, who had worked the estate longer than anyone else on staff, pulled Grace aside in the laundry room and told her plainly that nobody in that house had ever seen Vincenzo Conti sit at a kitchen table with anyone, not once, not in 11 years of service, and that whatever Grace thought she understood about her position here, she should understand that fact most of all. Grace said nothing in response beyond a nod, but she carried the words with her the rest of that day, turning them over the way she turned over everything, carefully, without letting herself reach for a conclusion faster than the evidence warranted. Vincenzo stopped pretending his visits to whatever room she cleaned were coincidental. Grace stopped pretending she minded. It was in the small library off his study, 10 days after the confrontation in the foyer, that Grace found the ledger left open on the reading table, the one detailing Matteo's debts to Falco's family, debts that had grown considerably larger and more dangerous than the $12,000 taken from the study drawer. She was not meant to see it. She understood that the moment she looked at the numbers, understood that whatever was written there was the kind of information that could get a person killed, simply for knowing it existed. She read it anyway. Vincenzo found her there 20 minutes later, the ledger still open, Grace sitting very still with the weight of what she now knew settled heavy across her shoulders. You shouldn't have seen that, he said, quiet, and for the first time since she had met him, there was something close to fear in his voice. Not for himself, she understood, but for what knowing might cost her. I already know what world I'm living in, Vincenzo, she said, using his first name for the first time, and watched the effect it had on him, something in his shoulders loosening even as his jaw tightened. I've known since the night I told you your nephew was the one on those stairs. Seeing the numbers doesn't change what I already understood. It changes what I have to protect now, he said. You knowing this puts you inside something you have every reason to want no part of. Grace closed the ledger slowly and set it back exactly where she had found it. Precise, deliberate, the same care she brought to every task in this house. Then I suppose you'll have to decide whether protecting me means sending me away or keeping me close enough that you can do it yourself. The silence that followed held a different weight than any silence before it, and when Vincenzo finally crossed the small distance of the library floor between them, there was none of the calculation Grace had come to expect from him, only the particular honesty of a man who had run out of reasons to hold back. I do not know how to want something as simple as this, he said. Everything in my life has a cost. I have spent years making certain nothing gets close enough to be used against me. And then you refuse to apologize for something you didn't do, and I have not been able to think clearly since. That's not a confession, Grace said, though her voice had gone quieter now, the distance between them nearly gone. That's an explanation. Then let me give you the confession, he said. I told you to go, that first night, because it was the only way I knew to protect the thing I did not yet understand I was protecting. You stayed anyway. You did not explain yourself, and I did not ask you to. That was the confession, Grace. I have not needed to say more than that until now. The kiss that followed was not gentle, not the careful thing either of them might have chosen in a safer version of this story, but deliberate in the way everything about Vincenzo Conti was deliberate. And Grace met it without hesitation, without the fear that had lived alongside her attraction for weeks, finally losing its grip enough to let something else through. But the cost Vincenzo had warned her about arrived faster than either of them expected. 3 nights later, Falco's men returned, not to the front gate this time, but to the service entrance near the staff quarters, the one door in the entire estate that Grace herself had complained, months earlier, was never properly secured. She woke to the sound of a lock giving way down the hall and understood, in the half-second before full alertness arrived, exactly what was happening and exactly why they had chosen that door. They had come for leverage. They had come, specifically, for her. Grace did not scream. She had learned enough in this house over the past weeks to know that screaming bought nothing but time for the wrong people, and instead she moved fast and silent toward the small window in her room, the one that opened onto the kitchen garden, shoving it open and dropping into the cold dark before the footsteps in the hallway reached her door. She ran barefoot across frost-hardened dirt toward the main house, toward the one place in this entire estate she knew would have armed men close enough to matter, and she was screaming Vincenzo's name before she reached the terrace doors, all pretense of silence abandoned now that speed mattered more than stealth. He met her halfway across the lawn, already moving before she finished crossing it, and the look on his face when he saw her running toward him barefoot and breathless in the cold was not the calculated stillness she had grown used to. It was something raw and unguarded, fear finally showing itself on a face that had spent a lifetime refusing to show anything at all. "Falco's men," she managed. "The service door, 3 of them, maybe more." Vincenzo's men were already moving before he finished processing the words, and the confrontation that followed was fast and brutal and entirely one-sided. Falco's men caught in the narrow servants' corridor with nowhere to retreat and no advantage of surprise left to exploit. Grace stood on the terrace with Vincenzo's arm hard around her shoulders, watching the lights come on across the estate, feeling the adrenaline finally begin to drain out of her legs and leave them shaking. "This is what I meant," Vincenzo said, low, his voice rough in a way she had never heard from him. "This is the cost. They came for you because they know what you are to me now." "Then let them know it clearly," Grace said, straightening despite the tremor still running through her. "Because I am not leaving this house, Vincenzo, and I am not something to be used against you. I am the reason a man is currently on the ground in your servant's corridor with a hole in his plan to hurt you, not a weakness in it." Vincenzo looked at her for a long moment, something settling in his expression that had not been there before, a decision finally made and no longer deniable. "Falco will not stop after tonight. He has lost too much face to walk away quietly." "Then we make sure he understands exactly what happens the next time he tries," Grace said, and she meant it with the same steady certainty she had used to refuse his apology demand weeks earlier, in a room the size of a closet with her whole life packed into a single suitcase. The confrontation with Falco that followed, 3 days later, took place not in the Conti mansion, but in neutral territory arranged through channels Grace did not fully understand, and was not meant to, a warehouse near the docks where representatives of both families gathered to settle what had become, through Matteo's theft and Falco's escalation, a debt owed in considerably more than money. Grace was not meant to be present for it. She went anyway, because she had learned by now that watching from a distance had never once kept her safe, only kept her ignorant, and ignorance was a luxury she had stopped affording herself the night she chose the truth over an apology. She stood near the warehouse's rear exit, close enough to see, far enough to stay out of the direct line of whatever violence might unfold, and watched Vincenzo Conti negotiate the end of a conflict with the same cold precision she had first seen in him the night Falco arrived uninvited at his front door. There was no theater in it, no raised voices, only the quiet exchange of terms between men who understood exactly what they were worth to each other. And when Falco finally extended his hand, it was Vincenzo who did not take it immediately, letting the refusal sit in the room long enough to mean something before he finally, deliberately, accepted the terms on his own timeline rather than Falco's. It was over within the hour, the debt settled, the threat closed, Falco's family formally withdrawing any further claim against the Conti household, in an arrangement that would hold, Grace understood, because both sides now knew exactly what the other was capable of when pushed. Vincenzo found her by the rear exit as the warehouse emptied, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, taking in the fact of her presence there, in a place she had been told explicitly to avoid, and said nothing about it, because there was nothing left to say that either of them did not already understand. "You should not have come," he said finally, without any real weight behind the words. "You should stop being surprised when I don't listen," Grace said. "It's been 3 weeks. You'd think you'd have learned the pattern by now." Something that was almost a laugh moved through him, brief and unguarded, and he reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers in the cold warehouse air with a gentleness that felt entirely deliberate against the violence that had just concluded around them. "I have learned the pattern," he said. "I am simply choosing, every time, to be surprised by it anyway. Some things are worth being surprised by more than once." They walked out of the warehouse together, into a night that had gone clear and cold, the estate waiting somewhere beyond the docks with its long gallery and its narrow staff quarters, and the small library where a ledger had once sat open on a table and changed the shape of everything that followed. Grace did not know, walking beside him with her hand still in his, exactly what her life would look like from here, whether she would remain staff in name only, or something else entirely, whether the household would ever fully understand what had shifted between the woman who cleaned the floors and the man who owned every floor in the county. She knew only that she had refused to apologize for something she did not do, had chosen the truth when the easier path was silence, and had ended up, against every reasonable expectation, exactly where she wanted to be. "I am not going to apologize for staying," she said, as they reached the car waiting to take them home. "Good," Vincenzo said, opening the door for her with the same careful attention he gave everything that mattered to him now. "I would not want you to. I have had enough of people apologizing for things that were never wrong in the first place. You taught me that, in a room the size of a closet, before I had the sense to understand what I was watching." Grace got into the car, and Vincenzo followed, and the estate lights came into view a few minutes later, gold and steady against the dark, waiting for them both to come home to it, together this time, on terms neither of them had expected, but both of them, finally, had chosen. She thought, watching the gates open ahead of them, of the suitcase still sitting half unpacked at the foot of her bed in the staff quarters, a habit she had not yet broken even weeks after deciding to stay, and understood that she was not quite ready to unpack it fully, not because she doubted him, but because some part of her intended to keep the ability to leave for herself, always, a small private freedom that no man, however much she had come to want him, would ever be allowed to take from her. Vincenzo, she suspected, would understand that better than most men might, given how carefully he guarded his own freedoms inside a life built entirely around obligation, and she found a strange comfort in the thought that they might spend years learning exactly how much space to leave each other, without either of them ever demanding the other close the gap completely. If this story of a woman who refused to shrink herself for anyone, even a man who owned everything around her, kept you watching until the very end, you already know what to do next. Like this video, subscribe for more dark romance stories where the woman never apologizes for the truth, and tell us in the comments whether you would have packed that suitcase or stayed to fight for the whole house.